By 2015, Elizabeth Holmes was worth $9 billion on paper. She had graced the covers of Fortune, Forbes, and Time. Henry Kissinger sat on her board. George Shultz, a former Secretary of State, was her champion. Rupert Murdoch had written her a personal check for $125 million, and her core technology didn't work. Not barely, not partially, not in a way that needed more time. It didn't work, and it had never worked. And the people writing those checks had every tool available to them to find that out. The question this story raises is not how Elizabeth Holmes fooled everyone. That's the wrong question. The real question is, what is it about how human beings evaluate other human beings that made this kind of deception not just possible, but almost inevitable? Because the answer is not about her. It's about all of us. Elizabeth Holmes grew up in Washington, D.C. In a family with deep ties to government and institutional power, she arrived at Stanford in 2002, studying chemical engineering, and left a year later, at 19, convinced she had an idea that could change medicine. The idea was genuinely compelling. She wanted to build a device that could run hundreds of diagnostic blood tests from a single finger prick. No needles, no labs, no waiting. Faster results, cheaper access, democratized healthcare. She called the device the Edison. She founded Theranos in 2003 and spent the next decade building something that looked, from the outside, exactly like what Silicon Valley said a great startup should look like. A visionary founder with a personal mission, a secretive, proprietary technology, a board of titans, a narrative of disruption so clean it could have been written for a TED Talk. It could have been written for a TED Talk because it essentially was. The problem, the one that would eventually surface in a Wall Street Journal investigation by John Carreyrou in 2015, was that the Edison couldn't do what Holmes said it could. For most of its tests, Theranos was quietly using conventional third-party machines, diluting patient blood samples to run them, and getting results that were at best unreliable, and at worst dangerously wrong. Patients were being told they might have HIV. Others were told they didn't have conditions they actually had. Real medical decisions were being made on fabricated data, and this was happening inside a company that was valued at $9 billion. Here's the thing that most accounts of Theranos get wrong. They frame this as a story about deception, and it is. But deception alone doesn't explain a $9 billion valuation or a decade of unchallenged operation. Deception requires a collaborator. It requires people who are primed, consciously or not, to not look too hard. The psychological mechanism at work here is called the halo effect. The halo effect is a cognitive bias first described by psychologist Edward Thorndike in 1920. The core insight is deceptively simple. When we form a strong positive impression of one trait in a person, that impression bleeds into how we evaluate every other trait they possess. We are not rational evaluators, assessing each quality independently. We are pattern matchers, and we mistake the pattern for the whole picture. Holmes had mastered the surface signals of credibility so completely that the halo effect didn't just operate on her investors, it practically ran the room. Think about what she had assembled. The black turtleneck, a direct visual echo of Steve Jobs, so deliberate it couldn't have been accidental. A voice she had trained to be artificially low because research shows we associate lower voices with authority. An unblinking stare that investors consistently described as intense and visionary. A personal narrative of tragedy. A family friend had died of cancer. She was doing this for him, for all of them. And this is where it starts to break, because none of these things are evidence of a working technology. They are evidence of a well-constructed persona. But the halo effect doesn't distinguish between the two. Once the halo is in place, it casts light on everything, and everyone sitting in that room stops being an analyst and starts being an audience. George Shultz was 82 years old and a former Secretary of State. He had no background in medical technology. He didn't need one. He was there to provide legitimacy, not scrutiny. And he brought that legitimacy with him in full, because Elizabeth Holmes had told him a story that was emotionally coherent and visually impeccable. Henry Kissinger was 90. Rupert Murdoch was 84. The board of Theranos was not assembled to ask hard questions. It was assembled to signal credibility to the next person who needed to be convinced. Quick pause. I want to know what you think. If you had been in that room, with Elizabeth Holmes making her pitch, the board she'd assembled, the story she was telling, what would it have taken for you to push back? Drop your answer below. Now here's what makes the Theranos story genuinely disturbing and genuinely instructive. The people who did push back were not outsiders, they were insiders, and they were systematically silenced. Ian Gibbons was a British biochemist and one of the most experienced blood testing scientists in the country. He joined Theranos in 2005 and spent years trying to tell Holmes directly that the Edison's results were unreliable. He was sidelined, his concerns were dismissed. In 2013, facing a legal deposition that would have forced him to testify about what he knew, he took his own life. Tyler Shultz, George Shultz's grandson, worked inside Theranos and became convinced the data was being manipulated. He went to regulators. He then spent the next several years fighting off the company's lawyers, funded by his own family's money, trying to silence him. Erika Cheung, another lab employee, eventually became a whistleblower. She described an environment where dissent was treated not as scientific rigor, but as disloyalty. Holmes had created a culture where questioning the technology was framed as failing to believe in the mission. This is the second layer of the halo effect, the one that operates inside organizations, not just on investors. When a leader's personal narrative becomes inseparable from the company's identity, skepticism stops feeling like diligence and starts feeling like betrayal. The halo doesn't just protect the leader from external scrutiny, it creates internal immunity too. The ones who escaped it were the people who had no stake in the story. John Carreyrou of the Wall Street Journal had no equity, no board seat, no personal relationship with Holmes. He had sources, documents, and a methodology built on verification rather than narrative. And in 2015, he published the investigation that began the unraveling. But here's the detail that changes everything. The regulators had been there first. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services had inspected the Theranos lab. They had found deficiencies. They had sent warning letters. The FDA had flagged concerns. None of it moved fast enough to stop what was already in motion. Because by the time institutional scrutiny arrived, the company had spent a decade constructing a wall of social proof so dense that each new legitimizing figure made the next piece of scrutiny easier to dismiss. The halo effect, at scale, becomes its own defense mechanism. Carreyrou's first article ran in October 2015. It was titled, "With Remarkable Restraint, Apprise Startups' Roots and Intricate Ties." Holmes' response was immediate and aggressive. She went on CNBC. She called the story factually and legally wrong. She framed Carreyrou as an agent of the incumbent medical establishment, trying to protect their interests by taking down a disruptor. It was a masterclass in narrative defense. And for a brief moment, it worked. Investors publicly backed her. The board held. But the regulatory momentum had already shifted. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services banned Holmes from operating a blood lab for 2 years and revoked Theranos' lab certification. Walgreens, which had been running Theranos testing stations in its stores, quietly dropped the partnership. Then Safeway. Then the investors who had been quiet started asking questions that should have been asked a decade earlier. In 2018, the Department of Justice charged Holmes and former Theranos president Ramesh Balwani with wire fraud and conspiracy. In January 2022, Elizabeth Holmes was convicted on 4 counts of fraud. She was sentenced to 11 years in federal prison. The $9 billion valuation had been built on a technology that didn't work, a board assembled for legitimacy rather than expertise, a culture engineered to suppress dissent, and a psychological trick as old as human social life. We trust what we recognize. We trust what looks like what we've been told success looks like. The Edison never worked, but the performance of the Edison worked perfectly for 12 years. Call it the Theranos halo, the moment when surface signals of credibility become so well assembled that they substitute for the thing they're supposed to represent. The halo effect itself is not a villain's tool. It's a feature of human cognition, not a bug. We use pattern recognition to make faster decisions in an uncertain world. The problem is that the patterns can be fabricated. And when they are fabricated with enough precision, by someone who understands exactly which signals generate trust in a given room, the halo activates before scrutiny ever gets the chance to. Here's what the pattern actually looks like in practice. The Theranos halo has 3 components. First, the aesthetic of expertise, the visual and behavioral markers that a specific audience has been conditioned to associate with credibility. For Silicon Valley in 2010, that was the turtleneck, the jobs-like secrecy, the grand mission framing. Second, the legitimacy cascade. Each credible figure whose endorsement is obtained makes the next endorsement easier to secure and the skepticism of outsiders easier to dismiss. Third, the dissent suppression, the cultural or legal pressure that prevents internal contradictions from reaching external scrutiny. You don't need to be Elizabeth Holmes to encounter this pattern. You need to be someone who's hiring, investing, partnering, or deciding who to trust. Which is to say, you need to be anyone running or building anything. And here's where most people stop. They recognize the pattern in Theranos and assume they would have seen through it. The research on the halo effect suggests otherwise. It activates faster than conscious evaluation. It operates below the threshold of awareness. The people in those Theranos board meetings were not credulous fools. They were experienced, accomplished individuals who were subject to the same cognitive architecture as the rest of us. So here is the trigger moment to watch for. The next time you find yourself in a room, or reading a pitch, or evaluating a hire, or deciding whether to trust a partner, and the primary reason you feel confident is not evidence but presence. Not what they showed you, but how they made you feel. Not the data, but the story. That feeling is the halo activating. The habit is simple. Before you move forward, ask one question. What would this look like if the signal were fake? Not whether it is fake, just what it would look like if it were. Run the scenario. If the answer is, it would look exactly like this, that's not a reason to walk away. It's a reason to go one layer deeper before you decide. Holmes built a company on the assumption that no one would ask that question. For 12 years, she was right. The people who eventually brought her down, Carreyrou, the whistleblowers, the regulators who finally moved, were the ones who kept asking it. Not because they were smarter, because they had no stake in the halo being real. The halo effect doesn't just explain Theranos. It explains a pattern that recurs in every era, in every industry, in every organization that has ever placed a compelling story above a verifiable one. Holmes was the most extreme version of something far more common, the substitution of confidence for evidence, and the social machinery that rewards it. The question worth sitting with is not whether you've seen through a fake visionary before. The question is whether you're inside one right now, and whether the halo is bright enough that you haven't noticed. If this kind of analysis is useful to you, not just the history, but the patterns underneath it, the psychology behind history's business decisions, then the deep ledger is where that conversation lives. Subscribe. There's always more.